Is it truly possible that a young heiress to one of the greatest fortunes in the United States would renounce a life of luxury and privilege, a life that the world so readily offered her, to dedicate her entire existence to serving the most marginalized in society? The story of Saint Katharine Drexel is one of the most remarkable and inspiring in American religious history, a narrative that weaves together material wealth with evangelical poverty, the opulence of Philadelphia's high society, with the dusty missions of the American West, the splendor of lavish banquets, with the silent adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, born into the very lap of American high society. This extraordinary woman understood from a young age that earthly riches only have value when placed at the service of God and those he holds dearest. With her immense fortune, she founded schools, missions, and even a university for Native Americans and African Americans, and through her religious life, she offered the world a shining testament that love for Christ in the Eucharist and love for our despised neighbor are inseparable. Katharine Mary Drexel was born on November 26, 1858, in the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, into one of the wealthiest and most influential families in the United States. Her father, Francis Drexel, was an internationally renowned banker whose financial empire spanned the entire country. However, the joy surrounding Katharine's birth was quickly overshadowed by grief. Her mother, Hannah Langstroth Drexel, passed away just 5 weeks after giving birth. Little Katharine and her older sister Elizabeth were placed in the care of their aunts until 2 years later, when Frances Drexel remarried Emma Bouvier Drexel, who became a true mother to the girls and gave them a third sister, Louise. The Drexel family was immensely wealthy, but what set them apart from other prominent Philadelphia families was the depth of their Catholic faith and the generosity with which they shared their blessings. Francis Drexel dedicated half an hour each evening to personal prayer, and his wife Emma opened the doors of the family home 3 days a week to distribute food, clothing, and medicine to the poor of the neighborhood. Katharine's father financially supported various Catholic institutions dedicated to caring for the needy, and her stepmother taught the 3 sisters to practice charity from a very young age. Thus, Katharine grew up with a conviction that would define her entire life, that wealth is not an end in itself, but a means that God entrusts to his children to administer in service to others. Katharine's education was meticulous and comprehensive, tutored privately. She traveled throughout the United States and Europe, receiving the intellectual and cultural formation befitting her social standing. But alongside this education of the mind, Katharine was nurtured in a living faith that was not limited to outward practices, but sought to know, love, and serve the Lord with all her heart. One event profoundly impacted her youth: the long and painful terminal illness of her stepmother, Emma, during which Katharine witnessed firsthand that all the money in the world could not buy health or prevent death. That experience revealed to her with crystal clarity the fragility of earthly possessions and the necessity of seeking treasures that do not perish. In 1884, Katharine traveled with her father and sisters through the states of the American West, where she witnessed firsthand the dire situation of misery and neglect, in which the indigenous peoples lived on reservations. That reality deeply moved her. The Native Americans, dispossessed of their lands and confined to ever-shrinking territories, suffered a material and spiritual poverty that cried out to heaven. At the same time, Katharine became increasingly aware of the injustice suffered by African Americans, subjected to laws of racial segregation that deprived them of the most basic rights, including access to education. 2 marginalized peoples, despised by the dominant society, who had scarcely anyone to care for them. The death of Frances Drexel in 1885 left the three sisters an inheritance estimated at over $14 million, a colossal sum for the time. Catherine, who already felt a calling in her heart to dedicate herself to the most needy, understood that this fortune was an instrument that divine providence was placing in her hands to help those whom the world despised. She began to fund missions and schools for Native Americans and African Americans, but she felt that merely distributing money was not enough. She needed missionaries, priests, and religious sisters who would devote themselves body and soul to evangelizing and educating these peoples. It was then that she decided to go directly to the Vicar of Christ to ask for help. In 1887, during a private audience with Pope Leo XIII at the Vatican, Catherine pleaded with the Holy Father to send missionaries to work with the Native Americans and African Americans of the United States. The Pope's response was as unexpected as it was providential. Pope Leo XIII looked at her intently and said, "Why don't you yourself become a missionary?" Those words fell upon Catherine's heart like a bolt of divine light. The young heiress from Philadelphia, who had come to Rome to ask others to dedicate themselves to the mission, now heard from the Pope's very lips the invitation to give herself. The seed of a religious vocation, which was already germinating silently within her, had just received the water it needed to sprout with irrepressible force. After an intense period of spiritual discernment, guided by her spiritual director, Bishop James O'Connor of Omaha, Catherine made the decision that would astonish American society to renounce worldly life and consecrate her existence to God through religious vows. On November 7, 1889, she entered the novitiate of the Sisters of Mercy in Pittsburgh, where she received her initial religious formation, but her specific vocation went further. God was calling her not only to embrace consecrated life, but to found a new congregation, entirely dedicated to serving the Native Americans and African Americans. On February 12, 1891, Catherine professed her vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, to which she added a fourth singular and extraordinary vow to be the mother and servant of the Indian and black races, committing herself not to undertake any work that was not directly oriented towards their service. Thus, the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament for Indians and colored people were born, a congregation that united inseparably Eucharistic adoration with missionary work among the most marginalized. The very name of her congregation revealed the heart of her spirituality, the Eucharist, as the source and center of all missionary life. Because only from the encounter with Christ in the Blessed Sacrament could the necessary love to serve the most despised spring forth. The press of the time reported with astonishment the news that one of the richest women in America had become a nun. Newspapers called her the richest religious woman in the world. But Saint Catherine had understood something that the world could not understand, that true wealth does not reside in bank accounts, but in the grace of God, and that earthly riches only reach their full potential when they are offered in service of the gospel. From that day forward, Mother Catherine administered her immense fortune, not as an owner, but as a steward of Christ's possessions, dedicating every penny to the construction of missions, schools, and churches for those whom the society of her time considered second-class citizens. Mother Catherine's apostolic work unfolded with an energy and scope that astonished the entire country. Together with the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, she founded a system of Catholic schools for Native Americans and African Americans that extended across 13 states of the Union. It began in 1894 with Saint Katharine's School for Pueblo Indians in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and continued with the founding of colleges for African American girls in Rock Castle, Virginia, and in other southern and western states. Each school was a seed of hope, planted in hostile ground because prevailing racial segregation made quality education virtually inaccessible to Native American and Black communities. The crowning achievement of her educational work was the founding of Xavier University of Louisiana in New Orleans, initially established as a preparatory school in 1915 and converted into a university in 1925. Xavier became the first and only Catholic university for African Americans in the United States, an institution that would produce generations of doctors, pharmacists, lawyers, educators, and professionals who would transform American society from within. When the university was inaugurated, Mother Catherine explicitly requested that her name not be mentioned as a benefactor, and during the dedication ceremony, she sat at the back of the room, quiet and unnoticed. Her humility was as authentic as her generosity. The work of the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament was not without persecution and hostility. In an era when racial segregation laws dominated the southern United States and the Ku Klux Klan terrorized those who defied the established order, Mother Catherine and her religious sisters received threats, insults, and acts of intimidation for their work on behalf of African Americans and Native Americans. But neither racial hatred nor violence managed to stop their mission. By the time of her death, the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament had more than 500 religious sisters, teaching in 63 schools, and Mother Catherine had established 50 missions for Native Americans in 16 states. Her personal fortune, estimated at more than $12 million, had been invested entirely in that work of charity and evangelization. Those who knew Mother Catherine knew that the secret of her tireless apostolic activity did not lie in her organizational talent, nor in her fortune, but in her passionate love for Jesus Christ, present in the Blessed Eucharist. The adoration of the Blessed Sacrament was the center and foundation of the entire life of the congregation. Before going out to the missions, before opening a new school, before making any important decision, Mother Catherine and her religious sisters prostrated themselves before the tabernacle to seek the light and strength that only Christ can give. It was not possible to truly love the poorest without first loving the one who became poor for us and who remains hidden under the appearance of bread. Mother Catherine taught the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament that the Eucharist and social justice are inseparable in the body of Christ, given out of love for all men without distinction of race or condition. She saw the most solid foundation of universal human dignity. If Christ gave himself in the Eucharist for every soul without exception, how could Christians despise or marginalize their brothers? Because of the color of their skin, Mother Catherine's Eucharistic devotion was not an intimist piety, disconnected from reality, but a living source of commitment to justice, charity, and the dignity of all God's children. Her sisters were to carry Christ from the tabernacle to the most forgotten, being themselves living custodians of the Blessed Sacrament. In her spiritual writings, Mother Catherine recorded a Eucharistic spirituality of remarkable depth. She noted her prayers, meditations, and aspirations in small notebooks that revealed a constant and intimate dialogue with the Lord present in the Blessed Sacrament. For her, the Eucharist was not only the culmination of the liturgy, but the permanent companion of her journey, the loving presence that sustained her in difficulties and impelled her to move forward when weariness or misunderstanding threatened to discourage her. As she would write, "St. Joseph's feast brought me the grace to give the rest of my life to Native Americans and people of color. Every grace, every decision, every step of her life sprang from that Eucharistic encounter, which was the unexhaustible source of her charity." In 1935, when Mother Catherine was 77 years old, she suffered a serious heart attack that forced her to retire from the active direction of the congregation to the world. That tireless woman, who for decades had traveled the country founding schools and missions, seemed to have reached the end of her road. But in reality, she was about to begin the deepest and most fruitful chapter of her spiritual life. The almost 20 years that passed between her retirement and her death were dedicated entirely to prayer, meditation, and contemplative silence, lived from a small room, whose window overlooked the sanctuary where the Blessed Sacrament was located. Those years of apparent inactivity were, in truth, the most intense of her existence. Free from administrative worries and apostolic journeys, Mother Catherine was able to give herself without reservation to what had always been the center of her life, the adoration of Christ in the Eucharist, the small notebooks and papers in which she recorded her prayers during this period reveal a soul that had reached an extraordinary intimacy with the Lord. The woman who had spent millions of dollars in service to the poor now discovered that the greatest offering she could make to God was her own ailing and silent life, united to the oblation of Christ on the altar. The Church teaches us that contemplative prayer is not an escape from the world, but the highest form of service to humanity, because whoever prays intercedes before God for the needs of all people. Mother Catherine, confined to her room, continued to be a missionary through prayer, sustaining with her quiet intercession the immense work she had built throughout her life. Her example reminds us that apostolic effectiveness does not depend on our outward activity, but on our union with Christ. The most abundant fruits of Mother Catherine's life perhaps sprang from those years of silence, when the elderly religious had nothing more to offer the Lord than her naked heart and her unceasing prayer. On March 3, 1955, Mother Katharine Drexel gave her soul to the Creator in Cornwell's Heights, Pennsylvania, at the age of 96. Her death closed a life that had spanned almost a century of American history, from the Civil War to the post-World War II era, from the time of Native American reservations to the dawn of the Civil Rights Movement. Throughout those 96 years, one woman had spent a fortune of more than $12 million in service to the most despised members of society. She had founded a religious congregation, built more than 60 schools and missions, and established the first Catholic university for African Americans in the country. And yet, the true wealth of Katharine Drexel was not in any of these visible works, but in her love for Jesus Christ in the Eucharist, which was the secret source of all her charity. Pope St. John Paul II, who had a special fondness for American saints, beatified Mother Catherine on November 20, 1988. The miracle approved for her canonization was the healing of a young girl from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, who had been born deaf and completely regained her hearing through the intercession of Blessed Catherine. On October 1st of the year 2000, the same pontiff elevated her to the altars, through solemn canonization in St. Peter's Square, making her the second person born in the United States to be proclaimed a saint by the Catholic Church. Her feast day is celebrated on March 3rd, the date of her precious death before the Lord. Saint Katharine Drexel is venerated as the patron saint of racial justice and philanthropists. Her life constitutes a message of permanent relevance for today's world. Material possessions, far from being an obstacle to holiness, and can become an instrument of grace when they are placed at the service of God and those most in need. Catherine understood, with a clarity that few attain, that the true wealth of a person is not measured by what they possess, but by what they give, and that the greatest poverty is not material, but spiritual. Her example challenges Christians of all eras to ask themselves, what am I doing with the gifts that God has entrusted to me? Am I administering them for his glory, or am I retaining them for my own comfort? Saint Katharine Drexel reminds us that in the eyes of God, the only treasure that counts is love. Prayer to Saint Katharine Drexel. O Saint Katharine Drexel, servant of Christ in the Blessed Sacrament, and mother to Native Americans and African Americans, who renounced the earthly riches to embrace the infinite wealth of God. You who learned from childhood that earthly goods are meant to be shared, and that true charity is born of love for Christ, teach us to be generous with what we have, and to recognize the face of the Lord in the poorest and most despised. You who before the Blessed Sacrament found the strength to serve those whom the world rejected for their race, obtain for us an ardent love for the Eucharist that inspires us to defend the dignity of every human being created in the image of God. You who founded schools and missions to bring the light of the gospel to the most forgotten members of society, intercede for all who work in education and evangelization, that they may be faithful instruments of divine grace. You who in the later years of your life offered to the Lord the silence of prayer as your most precious offering, teach us to trust that God acts even when our strength fails, and that prayer is the highest service that we can offer the world. Saint Katharine Drexel, and pray for us. Amen.